I'm Raymond Douglas, and welcome to my man cave. Well, rather toolshed, or my special place of reflection. The Inside Out Perspective takes a look at life's challenges and its effects and asks one simple question: what race are you running? Good day and welcome to another episode of the Inside Out Perspective. And today I'm going to deviate from my planned thing of doing the armor of God, because I need to address the latest video come out by Adnan Rashid, trying to prove that the Quran is perfectly preserved despite all the evidence. Now this comes from a follow-on of the last couple of weeks of, and especially from Yashir's YouTube channel, where he said that the Quran is not perfectly preserved and that the scholars don't know the actual truth behind it, let alone the masses out there. That is the 1.8 billion Muslims who are just following blindly. So let's have a look what Rashid says about this.
We want to, do this video to nail this topic once and for all.
Yeah.
Okay. Nail the intellectual coffin of the missionaries and the Islam haters and the polemicists and Islamophobes. Nail the intellectual coffin once and for all. This is what we're trying to do in this video, so that they can't come back and open their mouths again and again.
Okay, so we understand that Rashid wants to nail the intellectual coffin once and for all. In other words, he doesn't want to answer any more questions about the errors and the poor transmission of the Quran in the latest evidence coming out by the big scholars. Now remember, I'm not a scholar. I'm kind of just standing on the shoulders of the people around me. So I urge you to follow the links down below in the description box, because that's where the true work is being done. I'm just reporting on it. This is just a recap of what he said.
As for the issue itself, every single student of knowledge knows, who studies Ulum al-Quran, that the most difficult topics are ahruf and qira'at, and the concept of ahruf and the reality of ahruf, and the relationship of the Uthmanic Mus'haf with the ahruf, and the preservation of the ahruf. Is it 1, is it 3, is it 7? And the relationship of the qira'at to the ahruf. This is a topic that when you're the beginning student of knowledge, you're like, what is all of this going on here? When you go a little bit more, you learn to simply memorize what your teachers say and regurgitate it out, and you don't fully comprehend. When you do a deep dive is when things get very, very awkward and difficult. And this isn't new. This is from the time of the Sahaba.
Okay, so very clear. Yasir is very clear what he's saying. He's saying that from an intellectual level, it's even difficult to understand the Ufraf and the Qurat. And that is the diacritical markings and the development of the diacritical markings, because it's common knowledge that when Uthman wrote the Quran, there were no diacritical markings. And this is the issue which the scholars are bringing up. Without the violation markings and the diacritical markings, how do you know what the word is? Because in Arabic, there can be up to 38 different words for one squiggle of letters, depending where you put the marks. And we've addressed that in a previous video. This is how Adnan responds to that.
I know what you're talking about, okay? But people don't know, the awam, the masses don't know what you're talking about. So my request from Dr. Yasir Qadhi is that he needs to come out and needs to clarify more in detail as to what he was talking about exactly.
I'm almost dumbfounded there. Adnan is saying like he knows, because he's very clever. But me and you as lay people in the street, the 1.8 billion Muslims out there which just follow, just taught to rehash things as Yasir has just told, and you're not allowed to answer questions, must just follow. Because we are not intellectual enough to understand that when you write a word, you need a vowel. Or in Arabic, you need the diacritical markings. Yasir, respond.
The issue of ahruf and preservation and qira'at and relationships between them, these are very, very difficult issues. And the most advanced of our scholars, they're not quite fully certain how to solve all of the unanswered questions in there. Ibn al-Jazari, who without a doubt is the greatest scholar of qira'at for the last 1,000 years. Ibn al-Jazari famously writes, I have been thinking and pondering, I've been thinking and pondering about the issue of the ahruf and qira'at for over 35 years. Naifan with all the questions. My point being that this issue of ahruf and qira'at has troubled the ummah from the very beginning of times. Nothing new.
So here he's saying this problem with ahruf and qira'at is a troubling issue, and it's been a troubling issue right from the very inception of Islam. Why don't you Muslims know this? We know it. Yes, Adnan Rashid's take on it.
Our epistemology and the epistemology of Western scholars is not the same. Our epistemology doesn't have to be the same as the epistemology of Western scholars. Epistemology is basically theory of knowledge.
So he's saying that the Western scholars, like the Islamic scholar Yassir, epistemology, in other words, his acquisition of knowledge is very different to the true Arabic acquisition of knowledge. I mean, really? I mean, just think about it. You want to learn a maths formula, and I just remember one from school, y equals mx plus c. That's the straight line graph. How different is that knowledge in the Western world to the Eastern world? What difference is the knowledge of being able to understand that you need a diacritical marking on the squiggles in Arabic to be able to determine what word it means? That's not clever knowledge, that's common knowledge. So in this 2-hour discussion, Rashid comes up with 3 fundamental facts which, beyond a doubt, according to him, prove the Quran is explicitly and perfectly preserved. His first point of reference is the Birmingham Manuscript. The Birmingham Manuscript? Wow. Why doesn't he go to the Sunnah Manuscript? The Sunnah Manuscript is considered to be 97% complete. The Birmingham Manuscript is only 2 pages. But this is what he says about the Birmingham Manuscript.
How it is exactly the same. That 1st century copy of the Quran, the physical copy that comes from the life of the Prophet and his companions, is exactly the same as what we read today in my physical copy.
So, if you follow the link and you listen to his discussion, he actually goes and he reads from the Birmingham Manuscript. And I want you to have a look where he's reading from it. He's claiming to be a scholar of classical Arabic. But in truth, where's his scholarship come from? His scholarship is coming from, and have a look at the pictures up on the screen. His scholarship is coming from the BBC report. There's the picture from his video, and here's the picture from the BBC report. That is the folios going. And I'm saying to you, follow the link below and have a look how Hutan Tash has a look at it. She pulls out the reference manual and of the Sunnah Manuscript, and you see it open there on the desk when she's comparing things. If you have a look at Jay Smith's clips, he's got the Arabic on the screen of the different versions of the different Qurans. Here's an example of it. He's not hiding it off screen, reading from it and claiming that it is, whoa, exactly word for word, word for word, word for word. Firstly, what he's saying is that this is dated to the time of Prophet Muhammad. Now, the carbon dating of that is dated between 568 and 645. Now, yeah, we can go on the 2 extremes, and from a negative side we can say, whoa, that's before Muhammad was actually even born, or we can say, whoa, that was the time of Uthman. Now remember, Uthman only reigned from 644. Now logic says to me, first of all, to write a Quran in the 7th century takes well more than a year. So the chances that the Birmingham Quran is an Uthman Quran is very slim. But let's give it to them. Let's assume that it is an Uthman Quran. Or let's assume that it falls into the dating of Abu Bakr, the first Quran which was written just after Muhammad's death. I've got no issue with that. But let's really be honest here. The real scientific method of taking a dating system is looking at the mean average. And if we have a look at the mean average of that date, we get to a mean average of 606. That is 4 years, gentlemen, 4 years before the first revelation was given to Muhammad. So the chances are that this is actually a Quranic version from Abu Bakr or Uthman's time is very slim. And why do I say that? Because there are more than 12 references in the Quran which accuse Muhammad of just telling stories of fables and myths. Here's an example of it up on the screen. So let's have a look exactly what the Birmingham manuscript has to say. Now remember, it only is looking at portions. It's not the full surahs, it's only looking at portions of Surah 18, Surah 19 and Surah 20. The first thing which Rashid says is, oh, but this is the most important thing is Surah Maryam. No, it's not. It's the Gnostic account of the virgin birth, written way before Islam and the Quran was revealed. Let's have a look at prior to that. What do we have in chapter 18? We have the sleepers in the cave. The 7 sleepers in the cave who sleep for 300 years and wake up. That's a well-known written text. 200 years before Islam. Did Allah have to borrow those kind of fable stories? No wonder the Muslims or the Arabic people in Mecca at the time were saying to Muhammad, you're just telling stories and myths which we already know. But even worse so, what is in the Birmingham manuscript is the sun setting in a muddy pool. And then what Rashid reads is on Surah 20. Moses at the burning bush. Hallelujah. That comes out of the Bible. But I'm going to come back to this Birmingham manuscript because he brings up another point a little bit later. But another second claim to fame here is to prove that the Quran is perfectly reserved is coinage. And he digs into his little bag, as we can see.
And amazingly, Quran was so public within the first century, within the life of the Prophet ﷺ, that it was even put on coins. Okay, Quran was put on coins. The coins that were being used daily by people in the Muslim world. Okay, the Quran was on dirhams and dinars. I have a bag of coins here. Okay, there are coins. You have a bag of coins. I just found one, just looking randomly. Okay, and I have earlier examples. Anti-clockwise, it is written. The text is written anti-clockwise in a circle around La ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah. It reads Bismillah, Duriba hadha dirham biwasit. In the name of Allah, this dirham was struck in Wasit, which was a city in Iraq. Sanna, in the year Khamsa wa Miya, 105 Hijri. Okay.
Notice he pulls out a coin and he shows it to us. We can't really see it, but let's assume that he's 100% correct, that is a valid coin. It is a denari. But notice what he says. He claims that this is from the time of Muhammad and his companions. The companions use these. He goes further to say that there's lots of them available all over the show, and then he closes to say it was minted in 105 Hijraj. That's 105 years after Muhammad moved to Mecca. 105 years. None of Muhammad's companions were alive 105 years later. That would put them in the age group of 130. Impossible understand the deception which he's saying here, and he doesn't show any proof of it. There is no coinage for 60 years from Muhammad's death which show any reference to the Quran, to Muhammad, to Muslims, or to Islam. In actual fact, the coinage around Muhammad's time during the life of Muhammad have Christian symbols on them. Go figure that one. And if there's so many available on the market, and there's so many around, you can just dig into a little bag sitting next to your couch in your lounge, and you can pull out one. How come there are none in the archaeological record? None whatsoever. And J. Smith's quest is to find evidence for Islam in the 7th century. That evidence, apparently, is under a nud's couch. Now, the other point on coinage is, when a coin is minted, it's minted to honor the person that ruled at the time. It's minted in that person's rule, not 105 years later. It's a pride thing when it comes to coinage. And if you have a look at the revelation of the Quran and Muhammad's teaching, all it is about me, myself, and I, him, who he marries, what he can do. He can have more wives. He can have this. He can have. It's all about Muhammad. And you're telling me he didn't have a coin minted after him? Let's see what Anad's next point of reference is.
Okay, when you study the history of the New Testament, okay, the earliest copies come from a century after the disappearance of Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. The earliest copies that are little tiny weeny fragments as big as a credit card, this big, okay, P53 or P52 or something, I don't know what it's called, the Gospel of John. There's a tiny fragment which comes from the 2nd century CE, okay, potentially more than a century after the disappearance of Jesus Christ, right? And then they are talking about the preservation of the Quran.
Wow, this is an absolute shocker. So the Quran must be true because P52 is small and dated 100 years after Jesus' death. What? The Quran must be true because Christianity has got a manuscript evidence of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ dating 100 years after his death? I don't understand that. Really, I don't understand that. Versus the Birmingham manuscript, which is talking about the setting sun in a muddy pool, sleepers in a cave who sleep for 300 years and then wake up to see that Christianity has taken over the world, a Gnostic account of the virgin birth, and Moses at the burning bush, or historical evidence prior to the inception of Islam. And here we got P52 confirming the very foundation of the Christian faith. But you know what's even more interesting here, which is avoided by Adnan? And this is what Muslims try to do all the time. Oh, have a look at the Christian evidence. You see, gentlemen, the key here is the Christian faith is not based on the writings of the New Testament. Like Islam, requires the Quran to be perfectly preserved, otherwise it does not have a basis of faith. Christianity is based on the historical evidence of Jesus Christ's death and resurrection. And we have at least 3 external accounts of a Roman historian, of a Jewish historian, and a Greek historian who confirm the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ in their own writings. Now really, how would a Jewish historian confirm the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ against his own faith if it were not true? We don't need the New Testament. But the New Testament confirms that the Quran is true. In actual fact, what a nut has actually gone and done here, he's gone and he's pointed to the confirmation of the historical account in manuscript evidence. So he's confirmed the confirmation of the historical record of the manuscript evidence of John, confirming Jesus' death and resurrection. Now remember, the Quran denies that Jesus ever died on the cross. But Adnan's confirming this through P52. And he's accepting that it's authentic. So what has Adnan done? He's just proven that the revelation of the Quran is, in actual fact, a false revelation. It's very interesting what Adnan goes and says next.
We know exactly what's there, and we know how our scholars have explained all these reports. Okay, just because Western scholars cannot get their heads around these reports, and just because they cannot accept certain reports, okay, you know, Western scholars, they work in a very funny way. What we deem authentic, they will say no, it doesn't seem authentic. They will leave it, and then they will apply their own self-concocted criteria on Islamic sources, and they will bring something inauthentic from Islamic sources, and they will say this seems to be authentic, and we will go by that. This is how Western academics work. They don't go by our epistemology. They don't follow our boundaries, our limits of authenticity and inauthenticity of hadith or reports. They concoct their own ideas, their own standards, and they go by their own standards. Now, just because they do that, do we have to agree with them? No.
So here he's generalizing around the aruf and the quadrat or the diacritical markings, and he's saying, whoa, but hold on, this is what the Western scholars do. They just make up their own thing and they come to their own terminology, and Islam doesn't have to accept that. Now we know Islam denies historical records, and they deny anything. If it doesn't fit the Quran, it must mean it's wrong. So, for argument's sake, and I'm going to give this one to Adnan. Let's use his methodology. Let's use his methodology of the Birmingham manuscript. So, based on the Birmingham manuscript, can we honestly say that those two pieces of paper, the 4 years, because they're written on both sides, confirm the Islamic doctrine of Tawhid? Does the sun setting in a muddy pool confirm that Muhammad is a prophet? Does the sleepers in the cave of Ephesus, sleeping for 300 years and then waking up to see that Christianity has taken over the world, does that confirm Allah as the true God of creation? Or should we have a look at the vast amount of historical manuscript evidence for the New Testament? And here I'm talking of over 25,000 manuscripts. Yes, I fully accept the New Testament is based on copies of copies of copies of copies. But we understand why. Because the historical evidence shows there was extreme persecution at the inception of Christianity. Christians died and were hung on a cross for just claiming to love Jesus, let alone holding a manuscript. But let's see what Rashid says about that.
After all those wars and chaos and fires and destruction, the Mongol invasions and the Crusades, and then destruction of Islamic heritage in Spain and Andalus and all of that, despite all that destruction, these copies have survived because they were in such large numbers. They were found in such large numbers throughout the Muslim world, and that's why they have survived.
So, the manuscript evidence for the Quran only survived because there were such large numbers of them. And this is the dilemma which Islam faces. Where are these large numbers of manuscript evidence for the Quran? We're talking of only 6 major documents or manuscripts. One of them being the Sunnah manuscript. And my question again is, why did Rashid not have a look at the Sunnah manuscript? And here's why. Look at the picture above, because the Sunnah manuscript is a palimpsest. And what a palimpsest means is that the original writing was rubbed off, washed off, and a new text written over it. And under UV light, you can see the two differences of the text. And there are major variations in that. In my book, I went in and I did a little bit of a study of that. And you can see things like the 72 virgins. are not virgins in the Sunnah manuscript. They're a bunch of grapes. The hijab is not a face covering. It is a belt. And you've got those kind of problems with the Sunnah manuscript.
We end up like the Jews and the Christians, disputing about the scripture, disputing about the word of God. We need to standardize it. We are the authorities. We know exactly what the Quran is. We took it directly from the Prophet. We must now standardize it for posterity, for the future generation, so that there is no confusion and dispute. Allahu Akbar. This is beautiful. This was the best thing that happened in the history of Islam.
Allah Akbar is Rashid's claim here. Allah is the greatest. Why? Because the Quran is not like the Old Testament and the New Testament, where Jews and Christians disputed over its authenticity. I do not know of any Christian or any Jew who's ever debated about the authenticity of the biblical narrative. The Jewish records are impeccable. We see that in the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls. 1,500 years later, the two texts match virtually word for word. We've got 25,000 manuscripts for the New Testament. Not one of them has a typing. Not one of them has an eraser in it. Not one of them has the word Jesus inserted in it. They're in the text already, authentic the way it is, the way it was founded. You don't see on P52 someone trying to rub something out and change it to mean something else, like with the Quranic manuscripts. Allah Akbar. Allah is the greatest. So I don't know where he comes up with this. So the masses, I ask you and I urge you, do the homework. Check. Take the evidence, follow the evidence, and believe in where it leads you. Do not follow Taqiyya, which has been presented here. But let's have a look what Adnan goes on to next.
And the definition goes as follows. The Quran is the Arabic speech of Allah, which he revealed to Muhammad in wording and meaning, and which has been preserved in the Mushafs and has reached us by mutawatir transmissions, and is a challenge to mankind to produce something similar to it.
So this is Adnan's definition, according to the Islamic scholars, of what the Quran is. And it forms the basis of Adnan's defense. And notice here that the Quran is the word of Allah, preserved word for word. Okay, and if it isn't, we need to produce another text like it. Man, oh man, take Surah 113 for example, and just compare that to Psalm 121. And here's the point, which I mentioned in my previous video. Muslims have a look at the Crusades and point at Christianity and saying that is not a Christian act. And I agree with you 120%. I've got no problem with that. But have you ever questioned why that happened? And the reason that happened was because of scholars like Rashid hiding the text, hiding the truth of that, exactly like Christianity did in the Dark Ages. They hid the text on the masses. They only had it in Latin, and only the scholars could translate it and tell the people, the masses, of what they wanted to know. And they told the masses to pick up their arms and go to Jerusalem and kill Muslims. Do you think the masses would have done that if they knew that Jesus said, don't die by the sword when he has been arrested? Put your sword away, Peter. Do you think they would do that if they knew that Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself? Really? Let's see what Rashid's next point is.
We have reports from Uthman bin Affan radiallahu an, when the committee was standardizing the text of the Quran, okay, he sent one of his servants to tell the scribes to spell certain words in certain way. Okay, words, not sentences. We're not talking about chapters, words.
According to Rashid, they have reports. And notice, again, deception. He isn't honest like other scholars are, showing their deaths, showing the reports, whatever. We just got to believe that he has this report. That Uthman specifically told people how to spell the words correctly. Now my problem, and this is the problem with the scholars around the world which are asking the question, how can you spell a word if you do not have vowels? If you don't have diacritical markings? And this is the whole debate. And Yashir honestly says that the top scholars at the time of the inception of Islam didn't know. After 35 years, they still couldn't come up with an answer.
I've been thinking and pondering about the issue of the ahruf and qira'at for over 35 years. Nathan would have all the questions. My point being that this issue of ahruf and qira'at has troubled the ummah from the very beginning of times. Nothing new.
And these are answers which need to be addressed, because you, as one of the 1.8 billion Muslims, are just being led down the garden path and the world pulled over your eyes. Just follow. Just listen, because we know better.
You learn to simply memorize what your teachers say and regurgitate it out.
So let's have a look at two quick examples from Hatun Tush's video clip this week, which has come out, where they discuss these different problems in immense detail. I'm only using two. The one is, look at the different use of the same word with different diacritical markers, where the one is meaning a wizard and the other one is meaning magic. Now, which is the correct word to be used there? But this example of Abraham is very important, and I can see the example of that, because surely Allah knew how to spell Abraham. Is it with the E or without the E? Because when you pronounce it, it sounds like two different names.
To tell the scribes to spell certain words in certain way. Okay? Words, not sentences. We're not talking about chapters, words.
We've got Rashid here confirming that Uthman told the scribes at the time how to write each letter down perfectly, and he spelt it for them, the word. And tell me, how can you have a whole chapter where the word Abraham, a key prophet in Islam, is spelled incorrectly? And really, to me, when I look at my text, I expect an answer. If I go to my minister and I say, I'm battling with this text, I expect an answer. And what are they saying here? Not even the top scholars of Islam can give you an answer, because they don't know. And that's the problem. If your top scholars don't know and cannot give you the answer, do you think it is the correct faith to follow? But let's see what Anad goes on to next.
Before Uthman's committee standardized the text of the Quran and then presented those copies to posterity. A lot of missionaries, they talk about Uthman burning the Quran, for example. Okay, Uthman did not burn the Quran. Okay, these people, wallahi, sometimes when I think about them, why do they lie to their audience?
Very interesting from that clip. Here we're going back. He's trying to give credence to Uthman, and he's saying that us Western people who are questioning Islam are lying about the transmission of the Hadith. And we're saying that Uthman burnt the Quran, and he's saying Uthman never burnt the Quran. But have a look how Rashid restricts his statement. He's just said Uthman never burnt the Quran. Look what he says in the next couple of minutes, seconds later in the clip.
Forcing people to abandon their Qurans. Uthman simply advised them that those old copies you had written for your conveniences, just get rid of them. Those of you who have them in parchments, wash your parchments and write the new standardized text. And those who cannot wash, just burn those copies and use the copies we have standardized, so there is no that there is no confusion about the exact text of the Quran. This is the Quran.
Rashid goes back on his original statement to say that he never did. Yeah, he then confirms that it was recalled. It was either washed or burnt. And it was washed and the Sunnah manuscript written over it, showing that they're two different Qurans. And that's the very point of this. Which Quran is the correct one? Because today we have 37 different Qurans. saying 37 different things. Which is the correct one? And that's the question the masses need to know. Surely, I, as a Muslim, if I was a Muslim, had the right to know which is the correct Quran. And if you couldn't answer that question, surely I should have the right to choose my faith without being persecuted or killed. So, gents, I leave you with this. There is so much deception and uneasiness within the ranks of Islam, where they cannot give straight answers. And I'm asking you to go home and do the evidence, or follow the evidence, check the evidence, because it has a direct implication on your salvation and your eternity. And the question still remains, as always, what race are you running?